The creaking of a chair, a shoe sole rubbing against the floor, a sniffle, someone clearing their throat, a sudden hushing of leaves, the gentle tapping of raindrops, a dog barking in the distance, frustrated exhales, footsteps, people leaving the hall. 70 years have gone by since David Tudor opened and closed the piano lid 6 times without touching a single key for the first performance of John Cage's controversial 433. This deceptively simple composition quietly changed the way we think about music, art, and perception. It bravely relinquished norms and conventions in order to contain, not represent, an unrepeatable acoustic milieu, a mediated, relentlessly present, and irremediably meaningless. 433 is equally loved and loathed with surprising intensity. It has spurred endless academic scrutiny and garnered criticism from many disciplinary perspectives. To those who get it, 433 is an existentialist portal to a heightened sense of interconnectedness with earthly existence. To those who do not, it is the ultimate art joke, an unequivocally pretentious incarnation of all that's gone wrong with modern art. Enigmatic, unnerving, unbearable, and even exhilarating, 433 bears conceptual similarities to Marcel Duchamp's Baroness von Freytag-Lorengoven's Fountain from 1917, at least in its ability to pose radical questions. Cage's silent piece asked, what is music? What is silence? What is the difference between music and noise? Similarly, 35 years earlier, Fountain asked, what is art? What is artistic intention? What is the substantial difference between high art and craft? Following their tumultuous introduction to art audiences, in time, both have become pillars of the Western modern canon, their influence reverberating into successive waves of key movements and styles like minimalism and pop art, whilst also setting the mold of some postmodern attitudes towards process, skill, and agency that still define contemporary art. So much has been said about both, and yet 433 still bears a layer of relatively untapped ecological potential that could greatly benefit future eco-critical discourses as well as creative practices grounded in Anthropocene studies, posthumanism, and queer ecologies. From experimental musician David Rothenberg to art critic Kay Larson, musicologist Benjamin Pickett, composer Kyle Gunn, and performance studies scholars Natalie Krohn-Schmidt, to name a few, the critical assessment of 433 have duly taken into consideration the multicultural set of influences that underpin its originality. Buddhism, I Ching, Christian mysticism, and South Asian aesthetic philosophy. Analysis of 433 often acknowledge that conceptions of nature and ecology, not unproblematically, played an important role in Cage's formation as a composer. And yet, this rarely, if ever, is chosen as the point of entry to 433 in the context of artist appraisals. The oversight begins with a lack of attention to the nature of the venue where the first performance took place, and how this fundamentally marks 433 as a pioneering, eco-critical artwork. The Maverick Concert Hall in Woodstock is an intimate barn-like auditorium built in 1916 by novelist and poet Herbie White to serve an artist community. The venue is situated at the end of a dirt road in the middle of a forest. The frame of heavy timber supports whitewashed walls pierced by small scattered window panes. An oak tree grows through an opening in the gambrel roof. Sets of doors open to the outside where additional benches can accommodate a larger audience as needed. Far from being a conventional classical music venue of the kind designed to exclude any acoustic intrusions from the outside world, Maverick Concert Hall is a permeable shell, a space that, from the outset, architecturally rejects the fictitious separation between nature and culture that has defined our being modern. In his recollection of the first performance, Cage emphasized the mixing of human-caused and natural sounds. You could hear the wind stirring outside during the first movement. During the second, raindrops began pattering the roof, and during the third, the people themselves made all kinds of interesting sounds as they talked or walked out. Subsequent performances, staged in prestigious concert halls from New York to London and Paris, away from the natural settings, therefore betray the original eco-critical element of the piece and reduce it to a more art-historically palatable critique of authorships, exegesis, and artistic agency. The fetishization that enveloped 433 over the second half of the last century has diminished the work's original intention. Performed in a conventional concert hall, 433 is reduced to an anthropocentrism in which all that can be heard is human-made acoustic inferences interspersed with those generated by the man-made architectural frame of the building. The non-human is entirely excluded. Only half of the work is performed. While part of the conceptual power of 433 resides in its democratic foundation, it can be played by anyone, with any instrument, anywhere, its performance modality should be more carefully considered in the context of Cage's well-documented lifelong interest in ecology. First and foremost, essentially because of the nature of the venue in which it was first performed, 433 operates a radical dismissal of anthropocentrism. The byproduct of humanism, anthropocentrism is a Renaissance dogma that placed the human on a pedestal and made us the measure of all things. Pervaded by humanist conceptions, Western art has for centuries elevated the human, rationality, above the non-human, irrationality. It diminished animals and plants to symbolic vessels of Christian morals and cautionary tales. Underpinned by colonialist ideologies of subjugation and bolstered by relentless capitalist extractionism, humanism at once shaped and naturalized a human exceptionalism that is at least in part responsible for climate change and the current sixth mass extinction. As evidenced in Silence, Cage's book published in 1961, the composer was very much aware that anthropocentrism had effectively impoverished our cultural landscape while endangering the health of our planet. In a letter to the musicologist Paul Henry Lang in 1954, Cage wrote, quote, "Art and music, when anthropocentric, involved in self-expression, seem trivial and lacking in urgency to me. We live in a world where there are things as well as people. Trees, stones, water, everything is expressive. I see the situation in which I impermanently live as a complex interpenetration of centers moving out in all directions without impasse. This is in accord with the contemporary awareness of the operations of nature. I attempt to let sounds be themselves in a space of time." End quote. The most simplistic art historical interpretations have over time over-indexed the existentialist notion of the impossibility of silence inscribed in 433, reducing it to a hollow theoretical cliché. It is true that Cage wanted us to reconsider the conceptual definition of music, duration, and composition, but not simply in an abstract sense or in the context of musical theory alone. His aim was to show that we had turned a deaf ear to nature, that far too intent on listening to our own voices, we had forgotten how to hear the alterity of non-humans, that the apparent silence of 433 could be an opportunity to hear ourselves becoming once again part of Gaia's incessant vociferation of all kin and kinds. Cage himself only performed the piece once in 1973, not inside a theater but in the open at Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A video of the performance exists. A few seconds in, a text appears superimposed on the screen. This is Zen for TV. Open your window and count the stars. If rainy, count the raindrops on the paddle. Do you hear a cricket or a mouse? Ultimately, 433 is about cosmological and ecological attunement. To perform the piece indoors means to distort and misrepresent its agency. On a deeper level, 433 essentially asks us to confront our anthropocentric deafness, the evidence of our alienation from ecosystems and environments, which in and of itself is inscribed in the word nature and how we still use the term today. The unattainability of the nature-culture divide, not as a simple philosophical hurdle we must overcome, but as the origin of a deeply seated cultural malaise that is today destroying the planet. The most radical question posed by 433 is not then what is music, and neither is it what is silence, but what is nature. The silence of 433 is more than an irreverent rejection of Western classical rules, a wholehearted celebration of the potentiality of chance, or a fleeting opportunity to focus on what we have been taught to ignore. It is an invitation to deconstruct, reconfigure, and rebuild beyond the strictures of human language. It is in the deceptive silence of 433 that we might find our place in time and space again, not within the pre-encoded objectifying and pacifying normativity of classical music, not within the fictitious pleasantry of artificial harmony, but through subtle, collective, and personal negotiations with the unscored dissonances and flaws that define our existence as indissolubly enmeshed with those of other earthlings on this planet.